Hello, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Pleasure to be here, and it was a nice opening of the conference. I liked it. I liked because first it reassures me that I came to the serious conference and it's not an unserious event, but also that made me feel connected with you so that we can have a genuine conversation and exchange of ideas. I was in New Zealand 10 days ago for another meeting of the OECD, and they also started the event with a spiritual ceremony, because in New Zealand everything starts with the Maori spiritual ceremonies to welcome the visitors from outside of their community, to welcome them and to make them feel reassured that they are well received and be part of the community to start a dialogue. So I felt the same in the same way there as well, except that New Zealand, the welcome ceremony was more scary, as you imagine. The same as the all black things, the haka ceremony, which was the starting. So yours is more soft and nice way of starting. My name is Yuri Belfali, and from the organization OECD. OECD is an international organization working for policies, to improve policies for better lives. And although the title of the organization starts with economic cooperation, we are not only working on economic policies. We are working all the policies to contribute to the better lives, and education and skills is important piece of the work that we are conducting. That's why I am invited here to talk about the education and the concept of togetherness from our perspectives. And this picture, you might think that it is against togetherness, but I put deliberately to provoke some of the reflections. Today we are living in an era where technologies, digitalization dominate a lot. And theoretically, any students can learn lots of things by himself, herself, without any other people. Or you can gain new knowledges even as adults without going to school, just by navigating web. So in this moment, what really togetherness means and what is really the purpose of learning. So that is probably one core question that I would like to ask throughout my presentation. And my presentation has two parts. First part is to reflect on the context of today's education. So John had started to mention, but I would like to highlight some of the important socioeconomic context that we have to consider when we talk about the education today and tomorrow probably. And the second part is a question for us to rethink what is really the purpose of education today and tomorrow, and what kind of learning we would like to expect, or what kind of learning and teaching we would like to provide through educations. And probably togetherness is a piece which will fit into that discussion. Starting with one of the important aspects of our society, technologies, digitalizations. Everybody is living in this world, wherever you live, whatever your context is. Who among you have smartphone? Please raise your hand. Almost everybody, but except some who don't use smartphone. Who regularly has contact or interact with people living outside of your country? Again, many of you. Thank you very much. So this is the reality. Then now we are also talking about the notion of community. The definition and the zone of community is changing probably due to these technologies. And technologies have both positive and negative side, and we need to be aware. New technologies offer opportunities, for example, in terms of learning, that students can have free and open access to whatever learning sources that they can find beyond teachers, beyond classroom, beyond schools. And also that has a potential to get rid of the barriers in terms of the equal opportunity for students to learn. Students in Denmark or students in Kenya or students in Hong Kong, for example, they could have the possibility to be connected with any other sources. Of course, language is an important issue, but even though you stay in your country, you have also the rich opportunities to discover the world. But at the same time, this includes also some of the downside, like cyberbullying. This is a phenomenon that many countries are really seriously considering because it is emerging among people, especially school-aged children. There are also downside of digital divide. It is becoming wider, the gap between those who have and those who don't have. So we have to consider this context when we talk about education. For example, internet. Well, most of you, 90% probably have internet or more, and this is the situation of different countries. Denmark, along with other Nordic countries like Norway, Iceland, Sweden, you are part of the group of countries who have the very high share of internet connection among people, whereas in the world, there are still some countries who have much lower share of people who have the internet connection, and this depends on also the socioeconomic situation of these people. Technologies are used frequently at school in many countries, but for different purposes, from browsing the internet to do the research, to use internet as one of the tools to initiate a collaborative learning among students, or for students to do independent research. And in all areas, interestingly, Denmark is a kind of exception that students are quite heavily using ICT at school, whereas many of the Asian countries, which are known for high performance in education, like Japan, Korea, or Shanghai, China, their use of ICT at school is quite limited. So this gives us a reflection, what is the role of ICT in learning in today's context. But also, this technological revolution impacts on the future in terms of the work. More and more, the job market requires skills and people who can work together, who can create new knowledge, and who can solve unsolved problems, or who can ask right questions to address the situations that you never encountered. These are the human encounters which robots cannot do, which internet cannot find solutions. So we ask our questions as well, that what is also the role of human being and what is also the value of learning for students. It's no longer learning or gaining the knowledge through education, but it is much beyond that, what the world is expecting to our students. Environment. As you are very much aware, there are many issues in terms of the global environment and climate issues like greenhouse world effect. You know that it's becoming more and more serious, the climate change and the consequence like natural disasters, the shortage of resources, and etc. This is also an important element to consider, because if we need to be actors to address all these global challenges beyond the immediate interest of your community or your country, it is also important to have the sense of responsibilities and the awareness and understanding of your role as a global citizen. People are also moving more and more from one place to another, or even without moving physically, we are very much connected, and we are living probably more in a more diverse society in the world. For example, international students, the number of international students is in increase everywhere, and particularly in OECD countries. Migration is also in increase, and especially the flow of migration comes from low-income countries toward high-income countries. What is interesting is that one of the OECD's works to understand the performance of education systems, we look into the difference of countries in terms of the learning of immigrant students and integration of these students in schools. For example, this shows that immigrant students, by their origins, if you look at where they are hosted and where they pursue their study, the result would be different. For example, Arabic-speaking migrant students coming from the similar background, speaking the same mother tongue, but if they end up in the Netherlands or Denmark or Finland, they have much higher chance to be integrated academically or acquire important competencies in school compared to those who end up in Qatar, where they speak the same mother tongue, but still they have lower chance to gain basic competencies. And the same for migrant students from Iraq and China, but China is a bit exception. Chinese migrant, wherever they go, they perform well. So I don't know if it is a cultural things. But this is about academic integration. How about social integration, which is very important too? To what extent immigrant students, when they are hosted in another country, feel like they are welcome, they are integrated? The picture is interesting. This shows the similar data, but we asked students to what extent they feel like they belong at school once they are settled down in these countries. You remember Finland and Denmark, the students from Arabic-speaking countries, if they end up in these systems, they perform similarly, but the sense of belonging is quite different. If they are in Finnish education systems, they feel very much belonging at school, but in Denmark, surprisingly, their sense of belonging at school is much lower than other neighbor countries. This gives us an important question. Why in this country of togetherness, migrant students don't feel very much at home or belong to school? This is a question for you. I don't have an answer, but it's important to reflect what is happening and what we can do. And this is the same for other migrant students of other origins. This is a trend that we could find through our study, PISA. So these are just some examples to highlight the context that we have to take into account. We are in the world of globalization and facing different opportunities and challenges. Beside what I have mentioned, migration, climate change, or digitalization, we also face different issues like social cohesions, emerging phenomena of extremism or violence in the societies, or questioning the values of the world. What is the common values that we would like to put in the center of the education, and what we expect young people to be. Then the second part of my presentation gives you a question, then what is the role of education in this world? I think the future we want should be the ultimate goal of the education. We would like to help young people to be an active actor and change makers to contribute to and build this world. So we are not expecting students to develop competencies to be acted upon by the external phenomena, but they become active contributor or builder of this world. We would like also young people to shape rather than to be shaped, or they themselves choose rather than to accept choices decided by others. So I think this is a guiding principle for which you might agree to continue the discussion. And when we talk about today's education, we need to think about tomorrow, because, well, today's education impact on the world of 2030, 2050, 2080. We are helping to develop the generation of the future. Then the future, we need to think about what will happen in the future. We are expecting that the future would be probably more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous given the current situations. And probably we need to help students to develop the resilience to overcome whatever the challenges that they might face or whatever the problems that they might face, because we don't know what kind of problems we might face in 30 years, 50 years, 60 years. So it is not to provide the answers to the possible questions, which is important, but what is more important is to equip ourselves and equip young people with the competencies or the capacities to understand the issues, to ask right questions, and to cope with unknown problems or situations that they have to address. It is also important, and this is why human being is human being. We create, we make new things, we innovate. That's what we can do, and that's why it's still very important that we work together and we are together and not just staying individually, separately, without the connection with each other or community and with the world. And as mentioned, we need to also care the sustainable development of the world. And this implies that not only understanding what are the issues in the global debate, but also some kind of attitudes and values to really fully integrate the notion of sustainability and exercise the attitudes like ethical behaviors. You think of the world, at the same time you think of yourself. These kind of things would become important in the future world, and how to balance all this. OECD is also putting the well-being as core part of our policies. We are not seeking education policies to contribute to the growth or social development, but the purpose of education and skills should be also the fulfillment of well-being of individuals and well-being of the collectivity. And this is the framework and the definition of the OECD in terms of well-being, which covers from different dimensions of quality of life, including health, education, work-life balance, or subjective well-being, the feeling of happiness, but also some material conditions to make our life in a good condition. I just skip to keep enough time for discussions. Then, sorry. So, when we talk about the purpose of education, before education was giving a map to students where they should go, but today probably education is rather providing students the compass to navigate this uncertain but challenging world, and to do so beyond the traditional learning areas in schools like basic numeracy or literacy. Probably we need to think much broader the purpose of education. These are some of the important concepts that we think we should put on the table of debate for education policies in the future, like the development of citizenship or empathy, to connect with yourself, but also connect with others, while you respect others' perspectives, but you also keep your identity, integrity or ethical behaviors, or leadership to lead the change, or self-confidence, self-awareness. All these things are important and actually really raised as of today by many research that there are important evidence to show that these are actually becoming important and will be important to cope with the future that I described earlier. And I set living in the world at the heart of this slide, but probably togetherness could be a core value or core concept to unite all these important learning areas together. But at the same time, this is a concept that I am learning. That's why I'm here to engage in a discussion with you today. So I hope by the end of today, I could better understand the concept of togetherness as you describe. But the challenge is, everybody agree that these dimensions of learnings are important, but how it could be translated in teaching and learning. Because in many countries, teaching is based on curriculum, national or subnational or school-level curriculum, depending on the structure of the education systems. And these are not the things which are explicitly integrated in the visions of education or curriculum of education, except some countries who are really making efforts to make these explicit. That's why the OECD is now working under the framework of a project called the Future of Education and Skills, Education 2030, to ask the question what children have to learn to prepare our future, and how these learning areas could be framed, defined, and organized in a way that any people from different education systems can understand and can debate in a structured manner using the similar languages. Although the decision what should be really the purpose of education could be different depending on countries, depending on the context, depending on schools. Then in our work, and of course Denmark is one of the participating countries very active in this endeavor, we are coming up with this conceptual frame that learning area could be probably grouped in 3 areas. Knowledge, including the subject knowledge, but also interdisciplinary knowledge or practical knowledge to do some concrete things. Skills, including cognitive skills, but also social and emotional skills. And even physical skills, the physical well-being, to be well and to be physically sound. And countries participating in this endeavor all agree that attitudes and values should be part of the picture, but this is the area where international community doesn't have much research, much experiences. That's why we are trying to advance our work to really have the common language across countries to debate and study and define attitudes and values to be discussed in the education policy platform. Then when we talk about competencies, this is a kind of fusion of all these 3 dimensions of learning. Knowledge and skills and attitudes, values together could create competencies which are necessary for students to take actions, to be an agent, to contribute to the world and to change the world. One area where we still need further work, I mentioned, that is social emotional skills. But at the same time, we are also starting to understand how countries are defining and including social and emotional dimensions of learning in their curriculum, in their assessment. For example, the skills to achieve goals with the perseverance, self-control, or passion for goals. Some countries like UK, New Zealand, or Korea are including in their assessment or in their curriculum framework. The same for emotional sides, managing emotion, self-esteem, optimism, or confidence. These are things that some countries like Norway is explicitly taking into account. I give you also some example of country curriculum or country education vision framework, how they shape all these different dimensions to express their value of education. This is an example of Australia. They are redesigning their educational framework, and try to capture the holistic way of looking at children's learning and development, putting in the center their core values, like they want students to be successful learners, confident and creative individuals, and active and informed citizens, and place different learning objectives around these values, including literacy numeracy, but also transversal learning like critical and creative thinking. This is too small, but I just explained that one example of Estonia, and they also set core values as part of the learning framework. Like they put the development of general human values like honesty, compassion, or respect of others as part of the important elements of the learning framework. Singapore is very known for its curriculum vision, which sets values at really the heart of the learning. And they have 4 core values. They expect students to be self-directed learners, confident person, concerned citizen, and active contributor. And they organize all the learning objectives around these core values. And this national vision is reflected in each school. So school staff members, school leaders, and teachers together, they shape their own framework, referring to these core values, but sometimes slightly different depending on the context and objectives of each school. So these are the examples of some countries starting the endeavor to translate clearly what they expect as the result of education. And OECD, in our work, we are having this project to discuss with countries in terms of the common international framework to help each country develop their own curriculum and learning framework, but also in our ongoing work for international assessment, PISA, we are trying to reflect these important learning objectives in our work. That's why in 2018, we are planning to include the assessment of global competence, which include different dimensions of learning outcome, like skills, to understand the global issues, but also to analyze different perspectives, not necessarily just insisting your perspectives, but the capacity to listen to and understand others and argue with people who have different opinions, for example, or attitudes of openness, respect of others, or global mindedness, along with knowledge, understanding of what's happening in the world and what's happening in terms of the relationship with your community and the world, but also how this is reflected in the values that students put importance. And this is not the test to assess all these dimensions, but it's rather the mixture of assessment to understand students' knowledge and understanding and skills of global competence, which we could do through the test like PISA, but also we ask questions through questionnaire to students to understand their attitudes or values, not to judge what is wrong and what is right, but to understand what kind of context we can find in terms of students' learning and students' being, and how these are related to their learning of global issues. So this is one of the efforts that OECD with our participating countries is making to respond to the emerging needs of educations and also to feed into the international debate on the important dimensions of learning that we will discuss today. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Shall I stay here, please?
Yes, you can actually stay there, I think. We have prepared some questions for you, and Jakob will show us the question on the PowerPoint. The first question is actually 2 questions. Is OECD's aim to identify, develop, and encourage best practice in education? Or, it's a slightly leading question, or do you recognize that cultural differences have a vital role and that best practice in one country may not be best practice in another country?
Yes. Well, my short answer is yes for both. It's not one or the other. We are trying to find the evidence to better understand what's happening in education. And that's why data collection is one of the evidence that we use to give a picture of different education systems and also help a country to have your own mirror to see where you stand, how you look like compared to others. Education used to be a very national, domestic matters, and countries didn't like comparison with other countries, saying that it is very culture specific, history specific, and we know what we need, we know where we want to go, and we know how we look like. But actually, OECD, when we started the work in education, we encountered a situation, for example, around the table of member countries saying that my country has the best education system in the world. And the others said that, no, 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 my country has the best education systems. But without knowing on what basis we are talking about and what is the good education systems, what are the definitions, what are the indicators, and how different are we, and where we find the challenges. That's why we collect as much as possible any indications, indicators, student assessment results to understand education systems performance. We are not talking about student individual performance assessment, we are not doing that. Or more qualitative analysis of policies and practices. And we put all this information together to say that among these countries, probably these countries are facing the challenges of, for example, equity in terms of learning. In these countries, there's a big gap between students from lower or disadvantaged background and students with advantaged background. What we can do. Or we can find that some countries have the strong challenge of, for example, gender gap. There are, too many boys lagging behind, or too few girls going to learn science and mathematics, for example. Then, what could be valuable for countries is to understand that what other countries are facing the similar challenges and what they are doing to address. That is the international peer learning, which is the core work of the OECD. Provide the evidence and initiate a discussion among countries to learn from each other. But it doesn't mean that we borrow the policies of Japan and Finland because they are doing well and we just implant the exact same policies and practices in another country. We know that it doesn't work because I agree with your question that context matters. And it is important to understand why your challenge exists, where comes the challenge, and what kind of factors are related to the challenge. That's why we use a lot of data, for example, from PISA. Well, probably there are some questions later, but PISA is very much known as the ranking of countries because that's what media highlights. But if you look at all the data and analysis from PISA, it gives a very, very rich information to understand what are really your challenges. And especially that gives light on the difficulties that our students are facing. Because it's important to understand where you find students in difficulties or what policies are probably impacting on not so good results of performance or the motivation of students or learning context of students. So that could help raise the awareness of all the stakeholders, policymakers, practitioners to understand the challenges and initiate the discussions and debate to improve the challenge, to improve the situation and address the challenges.
That was a very elaborate answer. I have 4 more questions.
Yep.
And 50 minutes. But I actually like the idea of international peer learning. That's like, in my world, we call peer review processes. That is peer pleasure, sometimes. Well, in a world where there seems to be increasingly, or we are in a state of crisis in relation to our democracy, many would say. Do you think that togetherness can come to play a more central role in educational strategy? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
I think togetherness is an important core values that Danish education systems has been having for a long time, but at the same time, it has a very important international implications. That's why it's our interest to learn together what togetherness is about. So I am the second category, according to John, those who are discovering the concept of togetherness. But according to what I have heard so far and what I understand, it is actually a concept which includes different potential areas which could be considered in education systems to address the issue, crisis of democracy, or the increasing diversity that I mentioned, or crisis probably of the identity of global citizens or nationalities or your own personal identities. And as I mentioned, togetherness is very much important because we have the risk of divide. So it's paradoxal, but at the same time, it is significant. As we have the possibilities to more than ever learn or work independently and individually, I think the value of human being is to have the collective wisdom, collective connection, and collective actions to share the common understanding of where we want to go and common understanding of the challenges that we are facing and what we can do together. So in that sense, I think togetherness plays a very important role in education, but at the same time, I haven't seen how it could be crafted in the concrete instruments to advance the education based on the concept of togetherness. As John said, it's fluffy. We know that it's important. We know that it exists. But for the moment, it is not as explicit as the learning objectives of mathematics, for example. So our challenge and our homework is, well, Denmark doesn't probably have homework, but in my country there are many homeworks, is to put this in a clear way so that policymakers, teachers, practitioners, parents are all aware that this is important objectives of education and include it and integrate it in all steps of education, in teacher training, in parents' informations, in school leaders, development, and of course, students' learning and feedback to their learning as well.
Thank you. And I think you were actually pointing also at our next questions concerning the increasing emphasis these days on student competences. You said we need to craft the idea of togetherness to be able to work with it. Can we measure togetherness? And what would this imply? And would it also have implications in relation to teachers' training and competences?
Yeah. What we measure in the field of education depends on why you want to measure. For us, measurement is important to advance, to improve, to find the challenges and advance. If you don't know where you are, it's difficult to say whether you are in good progress or not. That's why we try to understand and use different instruments to measure the progress of education systems. If togetherness is part of that endeavor, I think it's important to understand, but it is not necessarily quantitative measurement or evaluation could be done in different ways. But at the same time, the reality is that if you don't measure or monitor, it doesn't attract lots of attention. And that's why it could be sometimes just forgotten, or it could be given less importance compared to others. So that's the dilemma. Togetherness, I leave it to you whether it should be part of the measurement or not. If it is a core value, in my personal view, shouldn't be the measurement, but rather to make sure that all the actions around togetherness are in alignment and measure whether they are in good track in terms of the progress. But some way of making sure that the togetherness is really embedded in the reflection and objectives. That's the reflection that we had when we started to develop the global competence. OECD countries believe that global competence is important, and as PISA has been criticized that we are only looking at math and science and reading, although we are not assessing the knowledge of math and science and reading, but it has been from the beginning the assessment of critical thinking and the application of students, what they have learned in schools in a real life. But as these social and emotional dimensions of learning is important, we would like to make efforts to understand to what extent students are learning and to point out the areas where policymakers need to invest so that they can help better students to learn these important areas.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Two more questions before the break. The next question concerns actually the title of today's conference, Togetherness as Motivation, a 21st Century Skill. And we're addressing sort of the future when we're talking about these skills which might be needed. But do you think that we can prepare pupils for a future that we do not know? And can we here today say anything meaningful about what the future will bring and what people will need to live a life, as you say?
Yeah. My short answer is yes and no. Because, well, I can stop and I can leave it to you to elaborate if you like. But as you can imagine, we cannot totally predict the future. We don't even know what kind of job exists in 30 years. There are many research saying that in 30 years, probably most of the jobs that we will observe at that moment are not existing today. So we cannot even imagine what kind of skills, for example, would be required in the job market in 30 years, for example. But what we know, and that's why we need to rely on and we have to build our reflection and discussion on that, is that future is uncertain. That's what we know. And future is really unpredictable. We know that. So why not helping ourselves to prepare for that uncertainty or predictable context of the future world? That's why I highlighted some of the areas where students need to really develop to prepare their future, like the skills and competencies to look at the issues and ask right questions. You don't wait for questions to be given, but you find the phenomena and you ask yourself the questions, why it is happening, why it is impacting on something. Then you try to find your own way to find solutions. You cannot just rely on what teachers have told you how to solve the problems and reproduce the same process of problem solving. It doesn't work in the future. but you have to equip yourself the sense of creativity, sense of innovation, sense of connecting dots to have a holistic understanding of the issues, or finding new ideas out of existing ideas by putting different perspectives together. These kind of things could be important to prepare ourselves, but at the same time, this is indeed something that already today some area, especially the business areas, are requiring. I had a conversation with leading business people in the world and asked the question, even today, what kind of profile they are looking for. They are not looking for people with specific occupational skills like ITs or technologies. They don't need that because anyway that changes. The technology of today, in 3 years later, it will be outdated already. What they look for is people who are keen to, or who have the capacity, or who have the potential, even though they don't see today, but potential of the growth in terms of collaboration, willingness to work with others, willingness to confront with people with other opinions and co-create something together, because innovation always comes from the collective reflection and not from just one person thinking excellent ideas. And communication. We need to communicate, to work together, to create together, to share together. And it is not about the language. It is really the matter of the competencies to express yourself, to understand what others say, and to listen to, not just physically listening to, but listen and incorporate what others are thinking and argue and interact together. So I think these kind of things could be very important for the future that we don't know yet.
I agree.
Good?
The last question. To what extent do you regard OECD's PISA studies to be the cause of competition between countries, between schools, and also between pupils on the micro levels? Is such competition positive or a negative factor in children's education as you see it?
First of all, PISA, I would like to just remind you the purpose of PISA. PISA is to understand the performance of education systems and not to assess school-level performance or student-level performance. So this is an instrument to understand how your education system is doing and what kind of gaps and differences you observe within an education systems and what kind of context associated with the learning outcome in general of students, depending on the background. So in that sense, it could impact on system level. But I think the question is not relevant for school level or pupil level. Well, at least there's no direct impact designed from PISA. Then I think competition wouldn't be a good word, because we are not provoking the competition who is number one, who is number two, although that's what you hear very often from the media. I'm sorry, there's a media, I'm not criticizing you, but that is the very sensational part of PISA, and that's what will happen in 10 days. 6th of December, it will be the launch of the new PISA results. So in the journals around the world, we'll talk about the new ranking.
But do you know anything that you can tell us now?
I know, but it's here. And you have to wait 6th of December, unfortunately. But at the same time, that is just one small part of the story. What is more important is to genuinely understand what is going well, what is not going well, and why. Why, for example, in your education systems, there's so big difference between advantaged and disadvantaged students. Like the question a while ago, why in Denmark migrant students don't very much feel at home at school? Why? Or what kind of teaching strategies teachers are using. For example, PISA can show that to what extent students are learning through teacher-directed teaching or student-centered teaching or more collaborative, learning environment, and how this is related to students' outcome in terms of the problem solving. So this could provide rich information to reflect on. That is really the purpose. That's why I use the word peer learning and not competition, because competition implies that somebody wins and somebody loses. I think for PISA, everybody wins, including those who are at the bottom, because that make policymakers realize that they are at the bottom, and that could urge them to understand why it's not going well and what they can learn from the experiences of other countries improving.
Thank you very much for your elaborate.
Thank you.